Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Building an API Security Program. Thanks so much for joining us. We've got a great discussion and presentation lined up for you today. This event is presented in partnership thanks to our friends over at Noname. This is going to be really cool. Before we get started, there's just a few things that you should know about the event. My name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'm serving as the host and moderator. As always, we want these events to be educational, and we encourage your questions there in the questions pane of the audience console. We'll be doing a Q&A session at the end of the event, so keep those questions coming. We also have some resources there in the handouts tab I want to call your attention to. Make sure that you check those out. And at the end of the webinar, we'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $250 gift card. If you're watching this on demand or recorded, of course, that drawing would have already occurred. The prize terms and conditions can be found right there in your handouts tab. And then with that, it's now time to bring in today's expert presenters. I'm excited to welcome, first off, Wallace Sann. He's the Vice President of Worldwide Customer Success and the Solution Architect at Noname. He's got 20 plus years in the industry, and he's been around a long time. He's got some great experience to share. I'm also excited to welcome Philip Villeroy. He's the Field CTO at Noname, and he's also been in the industry for many years. He enjoys advising customers, partners, and the security industry at large about his experience specifically around API security. And so with that, it's time to kick it off now. I'm excited to hand it off to Philip. Take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, David. So yeah, the agenda we wanted to share with you today is I'll share a little bit of our survey that we did at the end of last year on talking to customers about their API estate. We'll talk about building an API first business. And then Wallace will go into building API security capabilities and rolling out an API security program in your business. And we'll wrap up with talking about the Noname API security platform specifically as well at the end there before we go to questions. So the API security disconnect, as we came to call it, is based on a survey we did together with Opinion Matters, so an independent research organization. We talked to about 600 security professionals across EMEA and the US, and we asked them questions around how are they looking at APIs, protecting APIs, rolling out APIs, and so on. And we came to call it a disconnect because what you'll see there is that the amount of incidents that we discovered at these large organizations and the confidence that they have about their existing security programs really is a disconnect. So that really doesn't track at all. So more than 76% of respondents suffered an API security incident in the last year, and more than 74% did not have a full or complete API inventory. So the initial goal of building out an API security program and platform is really understanding what you have today. Essentially, if you can't see what you have, it's very hard to start to secure that. So at the same time that these issues emerged, they also indicated, or 71% of the people indicated at least that they were confident and satisfied that they have sufficient API protection. So that is definitely a disconnect there. The other quick thing I wanted to share on the report here is that the number of APIs at these large organizations has grown more than 200% year over year since the last time we did this survey. And it's now up to thousands, and in a lot of cases, tens of thousands of APIs in these larger enterprise organizations. So it's really high time to start thinking about this more programmatically. The real challenge, though, is that if you are a business and you are an organization, there's a lot of things that you already have to do, and you probably have an existing security team and security capacity that's not scaling with that demand. So there's day-to-day things that you need to take care of to run the business. Maybe you have a larger digital transformation program that you're trying to roll out. maybe you're trying to stay in front of the curve and be more competitive by looking at things like agile and continuous delivery. Most modern applications that we see customers roll out these days are very distributed based on microservices, typically across one or even multiple public clouds. All of these challenges lead to a lot of pressure on the security staff. So there's a real gap between the attack surface that's ever increasing due to all of the things on the left there and the amount of work the staff can really process. On top of that, add in a lot of regulatory requirements depending on the type of organization you are. And you can see this is really a sort of bad mix that we found ourselves into. So one of the potential solutions here is to sort of lean in. So you can either lean into this problem or sort of stand back and look at it with amazement. But if you sort of lean in by going API first, there's a lot of potential benefits we feel that you can achieve there. Now, I just want to differentiate quickly between an API first approach to development and being an API first organization. Of course, one will potentially lead to the other, but there's a lot of people who are an API first or even an API only organization. Stripe comes to mind, for example. So most of the services that these organizations deliver are externally accessible on the basis of APIs. That's how they monetize what they're building. That's not necessarily linked to building or becoming an API first development team, whereby you start thinking about APIs and API contracts before you really dive into building the application out itself. And that's really to align the teams around APIs and standardize the teams around using these APIs. The gentleman in the middle there is well known. I don't have to introduce him. That's Jeff Bezos. So arguably, he kicked off this whole API first idea in 2002 by mandating that all new services should be built on the basis of APIs. So everything should be a service interface, he said. Everything that any team builds should be able to intercommunicate with the rest of the organization on the basis of services and standard interfaces. And anybody who did not agree with that shouldn't be part of his organization. So that's a really, really strong mandate, and that again sort of led to this API first approach to things. So talking about API first organizations and Amazon and AWS, I have a couple of numbers here. So these are the top 10 API first companies. And the products that they deliver are valued over 1.5 trillion US dollars. I mentioned Stripe before. So Stripe is an API only organization in the sense that that's the way you consume their service. Is you consume the Stripe API. That's the product they deliver. They also just recently announced collaboration with OpenAI, whereby they will do a bi-directional collaboration in a sense. So if you want to buy OpenAPI advanced services and pay for them, you will be able to do so on the basis of the Stripe API. And Stripe itself is augmenting their documentation portal on the basis of GPT-4. And again, those bidirectional integrations are on the basis of API. So that's really the connecting tissue, if you will, across all of these examples. Standard Chartered Bank in the UK is another one. So they are launching an API first payout service. So their customers can integrate with this PaaS service, as they call it, not a platform as a service, but a payout as a service system. So they can easily do multi-pronged payouts to multiple customers. Another example is AB InBev, the world's largest brewery. So they have built a digital first platform for their B2B operations. And they indicated that more than 60% of their revenue is now flowing through this platform. So again, if you go down this digital transformation journey on the basis of APIs, it's really being adopted across verticals. One last quick example I'll mention is my previous company at Rubrik. We built an API first platform ourselves to really disrupt an old legacy market. So there's really a lot of attention going to this API first paradigm. And a lot of use cases can be enabled through this model as well. So really quickly, why build an API first organization? It sort of gets everybody thinking in the same way. So it has the potential to streamline internal workflows. Just by adopting this API first process, you can deliver higher quality software because you're sort of standardizing the way that you operate. There's additional efficiencies you can get from modularity. So there's a lot of reuse potentially you can enable if you say these different teams can consume each other's work on the basis of APIs. So there's an inherent contract between these different parts of the organization so they can build on top of each other and use these modules, if you will, to very, very quickly establish and build enterprise applications. It leads to a lot of flexibility, a lot of potential for customization. So if everything is enabled through an API, that also means that you can use the tool or the development language that's most suited for your process and sort of interconnect these systems, can be built on completely different platforms on the basis of APIs, potentially giving you then this first mover advantage. If you have an API that speeds things up, and it allows the organization to sort of innovate at different speeds. So you don't really have to wait for other parts of the organization to catch up. You can really go ahead and drive what you want to drive. And then finally, the key elements, if you look at an API first business, so you can take this documented API first strategy and culture. So if you really embed this API first idea into the organization and into the culture, and people know that there's this inherent contract, not just an API contract, but a non-spoken contract about how we do things from an organizational cultural perspective, that really has the potential to really make you more competitive compared to your competitors. APIs over applications, meaning you can reuse a lot of these APIs, right? So if you build an application, it's typically a one use case type of thing. You have a certain problem that you want to fix and you build an application for it. If you extend these services on the basis of APIs, you have the potential now to interconnect a lot of these applications and solve many more issues on the basis of work that you've done previously. So there's a lot of reuse potential there as well. We spoke about quality, productivity, and velocity already, and how APIs can drive that. Of course, if you're building services on top of APIs, you want them to be used. So discovery and visibility is really important internally and externally. So if you offer these services through marketplaces and so on, you want people to adopt your APIs. So that's an important aspect. Security has to be the basis and the enabler of all of this, but Wallace will talk bit more about that. And then finally, of course, governance can be simplified because of the way that these services are offered. So they're really boxed off services that you consume through APIs. That means that once people understand, regulations and governance around these things, they can be built upon and contracted upon as well. So with that, I wanted to hand it over to Wallace to talk about program aspects.
Awesome. Thanks, Philip. So, so really, what about API security can certainly help with this? And so, API security, like any other aspect of security, is not just a product you buy and you forget about. It's really a business and a programmatic approach to solving these challenges. And so, how do APIs fit into this? How do they fit into your business? How do they make us money? But also, how do they, present risk whenever there's some technological advantage that takes place that's transformational? There's usually a substantial risk that comes along with that. And so here it's all about the trifecta of people, process, and technology. A gap in one, the weakest link idea that, a gap in one certainly impact the other. But for efficacy, all three need to be working together. I've seen the best people in process work together with outdated technology, and it works just as I've seen the technology help support insufficient or ineffective people and process. And so an API security program should take into account your current state of all three of these and be adjusted or calibrated accordingly. But also show a roadmap to evolve is certainly going to be important, as the rate of change of the threat landscape changes regularly. We need to also evolve our programs. And so in today's state, how does it integrate with the existing workflows and the infrastructure? What do you and the business envision changing really in the short, medium, and long-term goals? And how would your security program really help or hinder that is really what we're going to focus on. So here's just some of the specifics around the critical capabilities of API security and an API security platform and program. This is really from a piece by Gartner that talks about API protection. You can also get it from our website, which we'll share at the end. But I want to just sort of touch on this part. There's three main topics to this. So think of it from a crawl, walk, run, or a foundational elements. First being API discovery, which is really the notion behind finding all of your APIs, discovering them, finding those that are sanctioned and unsanctioned, things that are you expect to see, and things that you do not. And that's really foundational to really any security program, let alone API security, because you can't protect what you can't see, of course. The second component is really around posture management, API posture management, which is I've discovered all of my APIs. Now I need to assess them to determine, ask the API and query the traffic and the API gateway, series of questions to understand and assess those APIs. And then finally, API run protection, which is really now I understand where all my APIs are. I've assessed them. Let's now defend them from adversaries in real time, in runtime. And then the fourth is really getting proactive around let's test them all and pre-prod, and let's test them during our development lifecycle. So really, when you think about all of this together, right? It's if you break down the first part is really around discovery, and so securing the API lifecycle really can start anywhere, but the reality is that you should start at the point of which is most needed to the business. A lot of our customers we talk to are just trying to get discovery and visibility, and so it's certainly foundational to build upon, and that's why you got to get this part right when you're building out your program, is because if you're missing something, there's a blind spot, and adversaries are very equipped to find that blind spot, right? The saying is we have to get it right every time, whereas the adversary only needs to get it right once. And so to my mind, discovery is a logical place to start, and it's the major reason to start, to not start anywhere else, but this discovery. But as stated here in the first bullet, as you can see, how can you secure it? API discovery connects to all of your cloud and infrastructure partners, third parties, think third-party applications, B2B, all those types of things. Comprehensive discovery means you see all of your APIs, the routes going through your WAF or your API gateway, but also finding those shadow APIs, your rogue, your dormant, those types of things is just as equally as important. But discovery is an ongoing thing, right? As your business expands and contracts, you want to have the program and technology and people in place to be able to adjust to that change in your evolution in your landscape. So after you've discovered, it's really around, as we mentioned, assessing. So one of the main things, we'll get into more detail about this, but it's really assessing means ingesting, analyzing a whole list of your APIs, having a full inventory, as I mentioned, those that you know about, those that you do not, shadow, rogue, dormant, etc. But also looking to the vulnerabilities of those. We follow a lot of programs will follow the OAuth's top 10 specific to APIs. So assessing the vulnerabilities, looking at misconfigurations. Most of the breaches you'll read about in the news have led or attributed to some form of misconfiguration with the API. So it's very important in posture management. Think of posture management really around minimizing the attack surface, finding the things, the vulnerabilities, the misconfigurations before the adversaries do, before they have a chance to. That's the position you want to be in, is being more proactive, minimizing the attack surface. But you also, it's through posture management, we're also going to find sensitive data is being exposed, PII, PHI, all those types of things. And this portion of the program should also certainly drive a lot of your compliance initiatives. So the third is really around runtime protection. Gartner talks about this as well. And this is really around, recognizing patterns or behaviors that suggest there's malicious activity. So think of things like specific to APIs. You'll hear a lot about BOLA, broken object level authorization, all sorts of things that can happen in runtime. But it's really a real-time analysis based upon establishing a baseline and triggering off an anomaly as it relates to that baseline. But also taking this information, looking at it in real time, in runtime, and integrating with your workflows, integrating with ticketing, and all your automated SIEM, SOAR type of SOC operations, which will then allow you to help build this into your business and your culture of your organization. But so think of, Discover is all about finding, posture is about assessing, and runtime is about defending those APIs from malicious activities. And then finally, security testing. Some APIs you can only see while they're running, right? While they're actually, or seeing the traffic while it's actually transacting. Vulnerabilities and misconfigurations, you want to detect things proactively. So security testing is around integrating to your CI/CD pipeline, understanding the state and the vulnerability and the misconfigurations before they're actually GA or released into the wild. So this is a much more proactive approach, because we all know the costs associated with finding vulnerabilities of APIs that are in production and refactoring them. There's significant costs in refactoring. You're taking things out of operation. Sometimes there's impact to revenue. God forbid there's a breach, then you're impact to brand and things like that. So getting more proactive in testing during your development pre-production is very, very keen on in your security program for sure. So what does the API security platform really look like as it relates to your program? It's really centered on all those 3 or 4 elements we talked about. You want to have that in one single view. You want to have everything from your API lifecycle or ecosystem built into one view. So you don't have to go into different solutions or different things to be able to understand my discovery, my runtime, and my posture management and active testing, or the testing piece. And so you want to have visibility to all stages of that lifecycle. And what's also we found very interesting is that, and these are 2 dissimilar things that typically you don't run into, but where engineering or development is now mutually inclusive to security. And what I mean by that is that these teams are actually now looking at the same data that they're both interested in from a single view, and it helps break silos. It helps the medium time to remediate much faster. So it allows both teams to be able to understand and mitigate the API risk much more efficiently. So as it relates to making API security programmatic, you think of this as your typical infinite loop. That's frequently used to talk about software development life cycles. And where do you really start in this journey is really up to your organization and their needs. And so talking about how making API security programmatic is very similar to this too. We always use this graph to sort of outline how we see our successful customers integrate their API security program into business, because let's face it, this is an emerging space. APIs have been around for a number of years, as Philip mentioned, but they're much more sophisticated, much more intelligent, and it's really on us to be able to build a program around this, and that's why this life cycle is so relevant to also API security. And so just to touch on this quickly. Whenever you're introducing any kind of new concept into the organization, you want to identify the people first that are going to be impacted by this change. These stakeholders are typically internal or external to your business. The focus here is really important because the people aspect are very important to any type of change. These typically include your API and product owners, your developers, your network and infrastructure, your gateway administrators, your AppSec team, your SOC, leadership, of course. But each of them will have a different point of view and a different impact based upon this change. And so next on the loop, you'll see here mentioned a few times is around communication. So change is obviously scary to some, but giving everyone a chance to provide that point of view and adapt is always important for change. When people have a say, they're much more inclined to get behind the change than if it's just created in a vacuum. And so that's why communication is very, very important, all aspects of the life cycle or part of this loop here. And then initiating the project. This captures many subtasks from identifying the solution providers that can meet the demands we mentioned earlier, but it's also around getting evaluation, selection, and deployment in place when you're looking at API security vendors. And so, skipping forward to a little bit to post deployment, the team really needs to get these, show incremental wins. We have found personally at our company that short, immediate, quick wins is very, very important to reaching your long-term end state. And so, when budgets are tight, showing this early on reinforces the need to continue to invest in your API security program. And so we found this again being very, very keen on organizations getting those wins, showing value, finding the people who benefit from this, having them, we'll call it sort of sell on your behalf within the organization. People tend to, be excited about the benefits things are providing. So they sort of help you amplify that through the organization, which really then always circles us back around to the stakeholder to make sure that, as the business changes and we need to evolve, we do this continuous loop. We get, the communication and the stakeholders back in the room and talk about this next stage or this next project. So what are some of the security metrics? If you can't measure it, they say, you can't improve it. If you can't measure it, you also can't manage it. So this is very important to keep in mind. Metrics are very, very important. And just so here are just a few that we can kind of touch on. Like I mentioned earlier, the OWASP top 10. There's also one specific to the APIs, which we're talking about here. But what this does is this talks about really four main areas: exploitability, talks about weakness and detectability, and then also the technical impact. Those are some of the factors that the OWASP top 10 talks about. But each of the factors is given a score, and 3 being the most severe, right? So you can kind of see where those things fall, and then that'll help you prioritize and rank where you invest most of your time to mitigate the risk, right? Mostly like anything, we need to prioritize where we spend our time. So having that as a metric is very important. When we talk about inventorying, we speak with customers all the time. We ask, how many APIs do you have? Typically, if the number ends in 0, we know they don't know. So the accuracy of that number can vary as it changes. We try to show them this is very foundational. It's very important. So getting a handle on your APIs, starting with finding them and tracking them over time, is really important. And then, of course, showing the delta between what they thought they had and what they actually have is the metric, right? Being able to show that gap in visibility. And then posture issues, you can think of this as your API report card. This will service all the vulnerabilities, the misconfigurations, the shadow APIs. So that's, of course, very impactful from a metrics perspective. The data use is also very important. The types of data, you may have 100 APIs that have no sensitive data, but easier to manage that handful of patient, financial, health, and personal data, right? If you have 5,000 APIs, if they're broken down by data types, it's much easier to manage those in one group. And finally, a lot of organizations probably don't think about this too much, both in the security or engineering software development role, but the software cycle time with an API first view of the business, developers build security into their daily operations and can address issues earlier. So meaning basically, software gets out, the door first. It's a great metric that you can show business value if you can get an application to market faster, right? Because if you get things to market faster, therefore there's a revenue benefit to this. And so certainly something you can measure, which is important. So introducing, the API security platform, we want to sort of touch on this to share with you our view, our perspective on this space, and we'll have some questions at the end. But so really, the API security, Noname API security platform is really the most innovative and truly comprehensive solution on the market, meaning it touches on all the areas that the industry talks about, meaning Gartner and others. And it's really centered around the discovery component. That's foundational, but there's really three key pillars, which you can see here. So posture management, as we talked about, this is really about de-risking your APIs. Basically once you get the robust API inventory, you fix vulnerabilities before they're actually exploited. So again, this goes back to that minimizing the attack surface, being much more proactive. Organizations really need to understand what type of data an API is sending or receiving, who owns the API, when was it last updated, when was it last seen, and is it configured properly? Those are all hygiene elements that will certainly minimize your attack surface. Any one of those individually is a door for the adversary to come in. And as I mentioned, misconfigurations is one of the top vectors that adversaries are using. Runtime protection, this focuses again on the actual analysis and the transaction as they occur in real time in order to detect malicious activity. It really enables the business to quickly react by first blocking the activity and then remediating it through your existing workflows. So again, think of posture management as preventative. You're preventing, minimizing the attack surface. Runtime is around detecting, so it's your detective control. And then again, active testing is really centered around being proactive as well, but doing it so in a way that it's in pre-production, saving you the cost of refactoring. And so it's all out of band. It's meant to be completely non-disruptive. We usually find about 30% more APIs than what the organization originally thought they had. Second, the platform really integrates with the existing infrastructure, integrates with your tools. You can provide auto blocking. You can create tickets. If you don't want to have a disruptive, you don't want to block things, you can certainly just notify and alert different groups within your organization. You can flag these items for further investigation, as an example. We also integrate with your CI/CD pipeline to run test suites that trigger requests to the API and find different types of vulnerabilities, again, pre-prod, and return the results natively into the developer tools to make efficiencies within remediation. And then really also to make things even easier, a lot of these capabilities are shared services within the platform, providing a centralized management dashboard, along with a bunch of analytics and reporting features. But the platform is really built on a modern architecture. It can be deployed 100% as a SaaS in a single tenant, or fully deployed and contained in your own four walls, as an example, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. We call it self-hosted. And because the APIs are part of your DNA and really in every transformational part of the business nowadays, we really can easily integrate with anything on your network, the data source types, and the workflows that you might be having today. So why is Noname really the leader in the API space? And so one of the first pieces you'll notice when you talk to different vendors is that we have a much broader sense of posture management. Some only discover, some only provide an inventory, but there's no analysis, there's no prioritization, and so there's really only one piece of the whole life cycle. And so ours is going to be the most effective posture management component that you'll see. The others is really around the actual piece around time to value. And so a lot of times you'll see things where organizations will try to, build this into their program, but it takes months or weeks, months, and in some cases years to actually get this off the ground. And it's the time to value is immediate. So as soon as we start monitoring traffic, you'll see this analysis take place, and we can get into more of a proactive posture versus a reactive posture. And then really the last is again the most flexible deployment options. A lot of the larger enterprises like on-prem because they don't want to send their data to the cloud. And so, for example, we of course pride ourselves on the ability to be able to deploy in SaaS and hybrid, and then also what we call self-hosted, which is on-prem. So really specific to our journey, it really starts out with we try to assess. We get into once a customer buys the Noname API security platform, we're trying to assess what are some of their challenges, what are some of their things they want to get, their end state, we'll call it. But then right out of the gate, we're assessing, looking at posture management, establishing that baseline, looking at vulnerabilities and gaps within their coverage. We then get into configuring. We start curating some of the data, building the data types, building the groups, we'll call them, for as I mentioned earlier about financial and things like that, or healthcare. And then we get into operationalizing, which is integrating into their workflows, integrating to their SIM platforms, creating playbooks. And now we're going to scale, meaning we're going to do this horizontally across their whole enterprise. Once we've proven this out in a smaller scope, we want to rinse and repeat that across their enterprise. And that's when we get into scaling. And then certainly optimizing is around educating the broader team, getting them into the boat, so to speak. And so where they're all recognizing full value from the platform. And so really, if you think about the impact that this has, there's really three main areas that the organization, the economic buyer is really concerned with. The first is around reducing risk. I want to protect my infrastructure, protect my brand, protect my, not having any type of breach. But it's really around, the reducing risk aspect and ensuring I'm compliant with whatever regulatory request I have. It's also centered around lowering cost, building some efficiencies, avoiding those insufficient investments. That's why we like to work with and maximize your existing security investments through our ecosystems, so integrating with your SIM, SOAR, ITSM types of things to build more efficiencies into your not only remediation, it makes it easier to find things, but it brings your costs down in doing so. And then if you're in the, as Philip mentioned, the API first organization, it's all about increasing your revenue or growing that revenue by being able to go to market much, much faster from an API perspective. And so I will leave you with that. I think now, David, we wanted to open it up for some questions if the audience had any questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great presentation. We do have some questions for you from the audience. Let's see. First one, I'll just start with this one. They're asking, from your experience, what are some of the challenges that organizations face when rolling out API security technology? Wallace?
Yeah, so I kind of touched on the journey there a little bit. The journey is sort of, the ideal state, where we go through various stages of activating, onboarding, adoption, those types of things. But what we found, since APIs sort of touch many parts of the organization, in other words, who owns that problem? The API, who owns the applications, who owns the risk in the organization. So there's various divisions or stakeholders within the organization that we have to talk to. But in some cases, we come across those that have bought the technology are not necessarily those that are operating the technology or going to deploy the technology. In some cases, we have some customers that are in different countries across the world. And so what we found is you need to flush that out early, both if being the organization, you mean the buyer or the one that's going to operate it, is to get an alignment early and often within the onboarding process to make sure there's an alignment that why the organization bought the technology and what the plan is to deploy it. So if you get that alignment early, it'll help speed up the deployment, because if not, you're you're having to start stop numerous times to get onboarding and adoption off the ground.
Yeah, great point. Great advice to get that alignment early in the process. Philip, here's a question. I think this one would be a good one for you. They want to know, how is this solution different from a traditional security testing solution?
Yeah, a couple of points I think are important here. So the security testing piece, or active testing as we call it in our platform, is one part of the solution. So we have a bigger part that sort of focuses on production, and then active testing that focuses on pre-production, which is the testing piece of the suite, if I can call it like that. So if you look at traditional testing solutions like SAST and DUST and so on, they really weren't meant to test APIs. So APIs are kind of a strange beast. So they are the intermediary between two applications, essentially, right? They're an application in and of itself, but it's really quite different. So typically when we talk about security testing in API, the first challenge is already figuring out if I can talk to all of the API endpoints that I have defined in my API contract. And then if you look at things, for example, like the OWASP API top 10, which Wallace mentioned, the number one issue on that list, for example, is BOLA. So if we talk about testing an API from a BOLA perspective, we really have to automate a couple of things. So we have to test the endpoint using different types of users. So what can one user do versus another user? Can I read data from user B with user's A account and so on? So it's really quite complicated. So what we did is we took all of the learnings from our production platform, we codified that into no-name specific API security tests, and that's really what we're automating now, typically integrated into a CI/CD pipeline. But generally speaking, I would say it's really a different type of situation that you're trying to handle. It's not a standard piece of application code that you're trying to test statically or dynamically using a traditional security tool.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I'm sure that's a common question. Another good question here for you, Wallace. They're asking, from your experience, who is the buyer of an API security solution in the organization? I know there's a lot of different parties involved probably, but who actually makes that decision?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it is, as I sort of mentioned there in my previous answer, it really depends on the organization, the size. I mean, we've seen organizations where they have a whole dedicated API group, and it really, again, it comes down to who recognizes this as a problem. But most cases, we'll get to the CISO organization. They're the ones that will have the budget to protect this problem, and so we'll see in that case the CISO. We also have seen in cases where there's been the AppStack team that has the budget to protect the APIs, and so it really comes down to, as you're looking within the organization, as I mentioned, that life cycle or that loop, when you're talking to the stakeholders, is who's driving the biggest change or who has the biggest impact by not doing this. And that's usually what you'll find is the budget will come from one of those groups, is who has the biggest or the most skin in the game to protect this problem. And so, but usually it's going to be the CISO organization that'll have the money to make this change.
Got it. Okay. And then what about deployment? What are the deployment options, and how do most customers go about deploying it?
Yeah, you'll find a lot of API security solutions are SaaS only, and it's again, the large enterprises that we're deployed in are risk adverse to doing things all SaaS, and so we found that having given them options, people always like options, and so since we do offer SaaS, hybrid, and on-prem, or what we call self-hosted, most of the customers go with a hybrid approach that gives you the benefits of both worlds. And what that looks like is, we have what's called remote engines. They would sit on site, so they would be doing the data gathering locally. It also helps with cost. Instead of sending all your traffic and having all these toll charges and ingress costs, it will stay local. And then we send some of the data up into their SaaS to do some of the analysis and things, like a lot of the metadata and things will go up. And so that hybrid approach allows for organizations to have the best of both worlds. And so we found that to be the most preferred approach.
Got it. I like that. Yeah, the hybrid best of both worlds approach. And so I know we're running out of time here in our Q&A. We got lots of great questions. I really appreciate all the excellent questions from everyone coming in. Last question I think we have time for, Wallace. I wanted to ask you, what should folks do to get started with Noname Security?
Yeah, it's a very important to us question. And so really it's around, come to our website, nonamesecurity.com. We can give you the ability to just start out with a demo. We can also do a free trial. That's also very important to organizations. They want to get their hands on it. So you can do a demo. We do POBs or a trial. And we also offer something called a workshop, which is very, very interesting because it's one part educational. We recognize that this is an emerging space that it's an emerging space, but it's also very critical. I mean, it's the top attack vector according to Gartner. And so organizations are much more motivated to learn more about it. And so we offer a workshop, which is free of charge as well. We come on site. We always love to do them face-to-face because you can't replace that face-to-face interaction, but we walk you through a series of use cases that allows you to get your hands on the technology, but also learn a lot about this space. And so it's very, very important to take advantage of that.
Excellent. Yeah, I love that opportunity to get an educational workshop, especially one that's free, to help learn about how this could help in so many different use cases. I'm afraid we're running out of time here. We could talk about this for the rest of the day, but this has been great. Wallace and Philip, thank you so much for being on the event today.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
And of course, thank you to Noname Security for supporting the event. I encourage you to check out the handouts tab there for additional information. And of course, visit their website to learn more. Have a great day.
Hey, thanks, David. What a great presentation today. But before we wrap up, we do have one final piece of business, and it's the Amazon gift card prize drawing. So the winner of today's $250 Amazon gift card is Hugo Martinez from Virginia. Congratulations, Hugo. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want again to thank Noname Security for making today's event possible. That concludes today's event. Have a great rest of your day.